Thank you. Welcome, everybody. I am Pastor Michael Jeanette, Assistant to the Bishop for Formation and Communication in the Southeastern Synod. We welcome you today to our fourth and final Lutheranism 101 course in this series. We have recorded and sent out the recorded all the sessions, sent them out to everybody. If you didn't get them, we'll post a link to our formation page in the Southeastern Synod, elca-ses.org/formation. That'll come to the chat in just a minute, and would invite you to go to that website at your leisure, and you can review the previous sessions. We talked about what Lutherans believe, what's in those catechisms, a little bit about adult catechumenate, and then also looked at who is Luther and took a dive into sort of the life and times of Martin Luther and some of the colleagues that Martin Luther worked with. But yeah, we'll share that link with you in just a minute in the chat to get to our formation page. And tonight, though, we want to turn to some history, Lutherans in America, and wanted to dive a little deeper into that with Dr. Susa McArver. Dr. McArver holds a Ph.D. from Duke University, also an MA in religion from Lutheran Theological Southern Seminary, and a bachelor's from Salem College. Susa McArver is the H. George Anderson Professor of Church History at Lutheran Theological Southern Seminary, joined the faculty there in 1998, taught me and many of my colleagues, including our Bishop Strickland, years ago. And we were happy to be students there, but her particular research interests include religion in the South, women's history, and Lutheran history. Her doctoral dissertation at Duke University examined the history and changing context of Lutherans in South Carolina between the years 1886 and 1918, and is the author of numerous articles about American religious history. I will share just a fun little caveat. Having been a student at Lutheran Theological Southern Seminary, it was kind of fun to learn about the history of the naming of the Dutch mall, Dutch Square Mall, I think it's called, yes. and the confusion between Dutch and Deutsch. But that's a little side story. Next time you're with Dr. McArver, you can ask about that particular story. It's one of those fun things I do remember from my time at the seminary. If you have any technical issues, let us know in the chat. Danny Vogel is the name of the person that's running our tech today. I'm glad to take questions throughout the session. Please feel free to type in comments. Feel free to type where you're from right now if you like. We've been having folks from all over the ELCA and beyond joining us in our sessions. So without further ado, I'd love to turn it over to Dr. McArver to tell us a little bit about Lutherans in America. Thank you, Dr. McArver, for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be with you this evening. I appreciate the invitation. It's going to be challenging to get a lot of material in a short period of time, but I'm very excited that the Synod is offering this. It's a really great thing that you're doing here, and I'm so pleased that so many people have been able to participate. I do want to ask one of the perennial questions that has been going on since the beginning of Lutherans coming to this country is, what does it actually mean to be a Lutheran in America? What does that mean? And one of the things I think we'll see is different groups at different times and different places have answered that question in different ways. I want to take a step back, though, for just a moment and ask, why should we learn about history anyway? And I think the reason we do is because memory is very important. Memory is very important to us as individuals, to an institution like a church, to a nation, to a community. Memory is very important. I like to think that history is to an institution what memory is to an individual. History is to an institution what memory is to an individual. We are who we are because of our memories, because of the things that have happened in our past, have happened in our history. And the same thing is true of a church or of a people or of an institution. We as a church are who we are because of our memories, because of our history. So there's a wonderful quotation that's attributed to Søren Kierkegaard. that says, we meet ourselves on a ship already launched, on a journey already underway. And what he meant by that is when we are born, there's a story that's already ongoing. That story started a long time ago. It's continuing on. We join that story. We board that ship at some point, and the ship sails on with us on it. And then at some point we depart from the ship, but the ship continues to sail on. So we are entering into a larger story today that has been going on for a very long time. We may have entered it at different points, but history reminds us of how we got here and where we need to go. It reminds us of how we got here and where we need to go. We entered into that story of Lutheranism. We board that ship at different times and in different ways, right? Some of us are born into Lutheranism. Some of us stumble into Lutheranism. We all board that ship at a different time, but it becomes part of our story while we're here. Well, that leads to the question, how did we get from here, this long, long chart of all the different ethnic groups of Lutherans in North America, how do we get from here to here, the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America? How do we get from there to here? And that's a little bit about what we're going to do this evening. Now, I have to tell you, this is going to be what I call flash history, right? With all due apologies for the fact that I'm going to leave out an awful lot. I'm going to flatten a lot. And there's just going to be a lot of things we can't talk about, but we're going to try to do sort of a flash overview of the history of Lutherans in North America. I will also say, because this is a presentation of the Southeastern Synod, I'm going to spend a little bit more time with the Southeastern experience than with others, but we will look at all of the story. All right, so here's some questions I'd like you to think about as we go through this. What echoes from the past do you hear in our experience today? As we go through these stories, what echoes from the past do you hear in our experience today? What do we want to take with us from the past? Maybe we need something to recover. We want to hold on to something. But what else is it time to leave behind? What is it time to leave behind? And finally, what does it mean to be a Lutheran in America today? What does it mean to be a Lutheran in America today? So let's start at the beginning. The first thing to say is, unless we're indigenous people, we all started this journey to North America as immigrants, right? We all came from somewhere else. Our ancestors came from somewhere else. Unless we are part of a native tribe on this continent, and there are many, then we came from another place. In the colonial period, when Lutherans first really began to arrive in this country, all the shipping lanes led to the New World. Everybody wanted to come to the New World if you were a colonial power and make money. So all the shipping lanes led to the New World. Lutherans began to come from many different European countries, some by choice and some by force, come to this country. Ironically, some who came by force left an important legacy to Lutheranism in this region, Region 9 of the ELCA, the southern region. The first Lutheran settlement in Region 9 was actually not on the mainland. It was not where we tend to think of, like, say, the Southeast or even the Northeast or the Middle Colonies. It was not even on the mainland. The first Lutheran settlement was in what was called the Danish West Indies, which is the present-day U.S. Virgin Islands. There was an enormous trade between the West Indies, I think you can see my cursor here, the West Indies, which carried rum and sugar over here to Europe. The flip side of that, however, of course, is that's just one part of the trade. To make that rum and that sugar, you needed a lot of labor. And so European ships would go to Europe, then they would come down here to West Africa, and they would trade with firearms or cloth or salt for Africans, and then they would ship them across the Middle Passage to places like the West Indies to do the hard physical labor of harvesting that sugarcane to turn it into all kinds of things, including rum. So enslaved Africans first arrived on the island of the Danish West Indies in 1673. But by 1700, not many years later, the islands actually hold a Black majority. There are actually more Africans in the Danish West Indies than there are Europeans. And that has some interesting sort of legacies to the present day. This is Frederick Lutheran Church, which was founded on St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands in 1666. 1666. Now, Lutheranism was the state church of Denmark, so it was also the state church of the Danish West Indies. Frederick Church was founded to be the church of the Europeans, but it takes them a while to think about, maybe we should also reach out to the enslaved persons as well. It's a long and complicated story we don't have time to go into in detail, but eventually the European Danes begin to make some changes in the way they worship in Frederick in order to reach out to the enslaved Africans. After 1770, they began to reach out by doing things like preaching and worshiping in Dutch Creole, the language of the enslaved. They allowed certain changes in worship services. You see this picture of this is a pastor. You see Pastor Michael is wearing the little tab collar. If you can see him on your screen, thank you for modeling that for us. That is the minuscule remnant of this much larger collar that looks sort of like a horse collar, right? That European pastors wore, which were incredibly impractical in the Virgin Islands. I mean, you can think about the black robe, this incredible rough collar, very impractical. The Danes began to allow the enslaved persons to worship in a much more informal sort of way. And they also created separate Black congregations and began to train leadership. Now, that's a mixed bag, but by creating Black congregations, they also enabled Black leadership to arise. And so the interesting thing is, within 5 years of when they start doing this, there were more Black Lutherans than white Lutherans on the island. Frederick Lutheran Church is now the second oldest continuing church in the ELCA. There's only one church that's older than Frederick, and that's in upstate New York. It's the second oldest continuing church in the ELCA, and it is a predominantly African descent congregation to this day. And so it has very, very deep roots that go back to the very beginnings of Lutheranism in this country, and it's a majority African descent congregation. Now, for those who came by choice, who elected to come to the American continent, they had all kinds of different reasons for immigrating. Sometimes they came to escape poverty. Sometimes they came to escape violence and war. They came to find a better life for their growing families. Basically, the same reason immigrants come today. It's always been the sort of universal pull and push for immigrants to go to a new world, to a new country, to find a better life for them and their families. And in our case, they came in sort of two large waves. They came in the 18th century and they came in the 19th century. And you can still see the legacies of that today. If you look at this really fascinating map right here, this is a map from 2010. There isn't an update of it, but this is a map from 2010, and every red dot on this map indicates a Lutheran congregation, an ELCA congregation. So you can see, I wish I could ask you to respond to this by just commenting, but we can't quite do that here. But if you look at this map, you can see several interesting things. For example, here in the coast of Pennsylvania, upstate New York, Delaware Valley, those places like that, look at all of these Lutherans, how dense they are. If you go across here out to the Midwest, the upper Midwest, you see tons and tons of Lutheran congregations. If you come down here to the Southeast, where many of us are, you can trace the immigration of folks down from Pennsylvania, down the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, into central North Carolina, or you can trace them coming up into Charleston, South Carolina, and coming up here to the Deutsch Fork that Pastor Michael mentioned earlier. You can see them settling here around Savannah. And you can notice that's where they settled in the 18th century. And those here in the upper Midwest, this is where they settled in the 19th century. And those today are still the stronghold places where Lutherans are more frequently found than in, say, Utah or Nevada or places like that. So where Lutherans are still the most concentrated is where they originally settled in the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, no matter when they came, Lutheran immigrants faced many of the same issues. This first wave that came in the 18th century was a pretty isolated group. When they came, they tended to come as individuals, young men, a family, or a small group of families. They did not, generally speaking, come as communities. They pretty much came on their own. With one or two exceptions, they came without pastors and without institutions. These were very, very poor people coming in the 18th century. And whether they found themselves in New York or Delaware or Pennsylvania or the Carolinas or Virginia, they found themselves on a pretty wild and woolly, multicultural wilderness frontier. Just to give you one example, this is a very beautiful and overly romanticized depiction of the ordination of Eustace Faulkner, who was the first Lutheran pastor ordained in North America. He was a German ordained by Swedes using Latin to minister in Dutch to a church made up of Scandinavians. Now just think about that for a minute. A German ordained by Swedes using Latin to minister in Dutch to a church made up of Scandinavians. That gives you an idea just in this one person of how incredibly multicultural and multilingual the frontier was in the 18th century. This is a detail from his ordination certificate. You can just make out his name here in the middle, Eustace Faulkner, and then it's signed and sealed. The first Lutheran catechism in North America was not published in English. It's published in Dutch. Again, showing the diversity of languages. So all these people are coming into a very unfamiliar context that challenges their definitions of what church is. There's no state support. There's no church institutions. There's no structures. They really have to make it up as they go along. So how will we define ourselves as Lutheran without the familiar supports we had back in Europe? That's a really major question that they have. Their languages, their customs, their beliefs, their traditions, and their attitudes set them apart from some of the larger cultural groups there at the time. They are Lutherans in a decidedly non-Lutheran world. And as time goes on, they're particularly Germans in an increasingly English-speaking world, as the Dutch and the Swedes sort of lose out in this first immigration. Here's an example. This is a parish register from a small town in South Carolina called Chapin. And you can see it's all written in German. You can make out South Carolina, Lexington district, but the rest of this is all in German. Now, some of these Germans, when they ask themselves the question, well, what does it mean to be a Lutheran in this new world? They define themselves by right belief. Others emphasized more right behavior, that was the most important thing. And a lot of people identify themselves as by saying both are important. We have to have our Lutheran confessions and our Lutheran beliefs, which leads to a movement called Orthodoxy. And we also have to behave as Christians should behave, which was typified by something called pietism. So different groups emphasize different sides of this equation. Some groups emphasize more right belief. Some emphasize more right practice or right behavior. And a lot of people are somewhere in the middle between these. So it's very unexpected to these folks to find religious freedom and diversity when they get here. They aren't used to that. They're used to being in a place where Lutheranism is the state church. and the state supports them. The state builds their churches. The state gets their pastor. The state pays the pastor's salary. None of that's here. And they can worship how they want, but it's also very bewildering. It's very bewildering to them. And it does allow for theological and cultural disagreements to flourish. Back in the old world, the king or the pastor would say, this is what it is, and that's the way it's going to be. In America, everyone sort of has the right to their own ideas. And that's a very different context. So they had to find new models for what being church meant that both drew on their past traditions, what they believed as Lutherans, but they also had to acknowledge they were in a new world, a new context, and things did not always look the same in Pennsylvania as they did back in Dresden or Halle. Things were very, very different. So with one exception, one thing I have not mentioned, with one exception in the 18th century, they did not come for religious freedom. They came just because of economic opportunity to make a better life. But only one group came for religious freedom, and that's a group that came to Georgia called the Salzburgers. The Salzburgers were a very small, very pious, very devout Lutheran group in the territory of Salzburg who were literally kicked out of Salzburg by their prince. Their prince was Catholic, and in violation of the norms of the day, he said, I have decided everyone in my principality is going to be Catholic, and all the Lutherans can either become Catholics or they can leave. So a lot of them left and sought refugee status in other countries, and a small number of them actually come to Georgia and establish a congregation outside of Savannah. They're also unusual because they bring their own pastor with them. Remember, most of these 18th century Lutherans did not. Bolsius was their pastor, and he kept a journal. And when they arrived in March of 1734, he wrote this: our community is very small and, praise God, in a very fine condition. Therefore, may the Father also give us through it, as it were, a sign into how we may best use the remaining time, to increase this white European flock with a few feeble Indians who nonetheless have been washed in the body of Christ, in the blood of Christ, and to prepare ourselves in spirit and body for the most important matter. So when they first arrive, Bolsius is concerned about his feeble white European flock, but also these feeble few Indians that they find. They start a church called New Ebenezer, or Jerusalem Lutheran Church at New Ebenezer. The church is still there today. You can still see the handprints. I don't know how well this is showing up on your screen, but you can still see the handprints of the children who made the bricks for Jerusalem Lutheran Church. You can put your hand in the place where they made those. The Salzburgers actually apologized in 1994 for kicking out the Lutherans, and they erected this monument of reconciliation in Savannah. It's in one of the squares in Savannah, as they apologized for kicking them out. Bolsius was a very devout pastor, very concerned for his people. He wanted to do so much more, but as he wrote in 1736, whoever reads our journal with some attention will not wonder that we have been able to give so little concern to the heathen in their languages. In other words, it is so busy carving out a settlement in the New World. I haven't had time to learn the languages of the heathen, the native tribes here, so that I can minister to them. In this community, we have full-time work with children and adults. We have no time for learning the Indian languages. He complains that the Indians are starting to learn some English, but unfortunately, when they do, this is to their detriment, since they learn it with the horrible curses, swears, slanders, etc. they have heard mostly in the drinking fellowship of the godless rabble, and therefore have noticed it the fastest. Everywhere things are very pitiful, for which may the Lord have pity. So in other words, he would like them to learn German, but they're learning English, and they're learning all the bad English words instead of just the good English words from all the people around them. He goes on to say, good examples make no impression upon them because they have seen for many years nothing other than the evil example of the white people. In terms of slavery, that becomes an issue in the Salzburger community. When the Salzburgers began arriving in 1734, hello? When the Salzburgers began arriving in 1734, slavery was actually banned in Georgia. And the Salzburgers were very pleased. They did not like the institution of slavery, and they were glad that it was outlawed in Georgia. But by 1750, Georgia has become a slave state, and the Salzburgers reluctantly support slavery on economic grounds. Boltzius did not want to do it, but his parishioners finally persuaded him. If they were going to own slaves, said Boltzius, the Salzburgers ought to at least Christianize them. So in doing so, if we're going to have enslaved persons, the masters must solemnly pledge to raise them in a Christian manner, even though they remain in bondage. So notice what's happening here. At first, they were against slavery, but now they've sort of capitulated to the larger culture, really, is what's happened. So Boltzius is saying, okay, if we're going to do this, we're going to make it a priority to Christianize them, to bring Christianity to them, even though they remain in bondage. And he goes on to say that, again, the difficulty is they don't know the English or German language. When they come from Africa, they know African languages. When they're young, they can learn English or German. But again, he says, I just don't have time to learn their languages. Ultimately, the effort to Christianize their enslaved persons is not very successful. Notice the difference here between what happens in the Danish West Indies and what happens in Georgia. In the Danish West Indies, they adjusted their worship practices, their training, their language, versus what happens in Georgia, where they expect the enslaved to, quote, become like them, to either speak German or English. One effort is much more successful than the other is. Now, I want to stop here for a minute, and I'm going to stop a couple of times as we go through and just pause and ask if there are any questions in the chat, or if anybody wants to raise any questions.
So folks, if you like, you can unmute yourself or simply enter in the chat. While you're thinking questions, I have one. Have you ever, Dr. McArver, have you visited that church?
Jerusalem?
Jerusalem, yeah.
Yes. Oh, yes. Many times. Yes. I imagine there may be some people on here who are from Jerusalem or have been there before. Also a very lovely retreat center down there. You know, I'm sure those of you in the Southeastern Synod have made use of the New Ebenezer Retreat Center before. That's right across the street from Jerusalem Lutheran Church. All right, well, we'll move on. I'll give you, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, how about the other church, the one on the Virgin Islands?
Yes, I have been there too. It's been a long time, but I have been there too. I keep hoping that a meeting will take me down there, but that hasn't happened in a while.
Yes, yes. All right, well, thank you. Any questions? I like to tell folks that when I served in Upper East Tennessee, I served a congregation that was founded in 1811. And as I tell folks, they likely came through maybe Pennsylvania and then came down I-81 like you were talking about, and settled in those Upper East Tennessee mountains. But I digress.
That's right. That's right. That's actually where we're going next, as a matter of fact. So we're going to take a flying leap now into the 19th century and move away from the 18th century. And now we're looking at a time when the backcountry all up and down the East Coast is becoming more settled. More settlers are arriving, more pastors are arriving. Things are not quite as isolated as they were. And it's beginning to fill up the land immediately on the East Coast. So that begins to send people into places like Tennessee, like you were just talking about. For example, exactly what you were just saying. Here's a map showing that immigrants begin to come down from Pennsylvania, because all the good land is now taken up right here close to the coast. So now they begin to come down from Pennsylvania through West Virginia, over from Virginia into East Tennessee. The first significant number of Lutherans actually settled in Sullivan County and then Washington and Greene counties in the late 1700s. And we also begin to see assimilation. There's a gradual change for these folks from German to English, a gradual change of language. And you can see that again in this same parish register we looked at a few minutes ago. This is the parish register of St. Jacob's in Chapin in German. And then in 1820, from one baptism to the next, it switches to English. So here it is in German script, right here. And then J.G. Miller and the elder and his wife's son, Simon, was born AD 1820, the 29th of April, and baptized the 10th of July. And from there on, it's all in English. So by 1800, there are two synods in the United States. There's something called the Ministerium of Pennsylvania, and there's something called the Ministerium of New York. And in 1803, the mother synod of Lutherans in the South is formed. It's called the Synod of North Carolina and adjacent states. In other words, it's everybody from Virginia down to Georgia is part of the Synod of North Carolina and adjacent states. There's not separate synods like North Carolina Synod, South Carolina Synod, Southeastern Synod. It's all one big North Carolina and adjacent states synod. And that synod was formed for a couple of specific reasons. One, people were worried that people were becoming religiously indifferent. They were also worried that people were becoming more captured by infidelity, religious infidelity, and rationality rather than the Bible. They were addressing an acute shortage of pastors, and they also wanted to combat something called evangelical revivalism. Now, in terms of religious indifference, the minutes of the North Carolina and adjacent states synod reported in 1812, many right after their confirmation are but seldom seen in divine service and only return to the church much later when married, when having their own children to baptize. So they're concerned that as soon as the young people get confirmed, they disappear and they don't come back until they have their own children. A few years later, a missionary rode through South Carolina, went 900 miles, preached 47 sermons, baptized 26 people, collected $45, spent $5. South Carolinians are guilty of the gross vices of intemperance, profane swearing, Sabbath breaking, and gambling. The excessive use of spirituous liquors continues to produce the most deplorable effects and threatens still greater injury in many parts of our country. So there's a lot of concern that people are just, going off the rails, going to the dogs. So we need a strong church synod to help oversee this. Another thing they're worried about is the shortage of pastors. In fact, the shortage of pastors is so acute, they decide we can't wait for a pastor to go to a seminary for 4 years. So we're going to put them in churches in stages. The first stage was something called a catechist, sort of like what we would today call a synodically authorized minister, maybe. This was raising up a person who had authority to be in a congregation and teach. A candidate could then be in that congregation and administer the sacraments with a special permission. Then they could become a deacon. They could do all the acts of a pastor, except they weren't ordained. And finally, if they went through all of those grades successfully, they could become a fully fledged ordained pastor and be eligible for call anywhere. But the issue was they just had so few pastors. They just needed sort of emergency pastors and brought them in without full training and said, we'll get you training on the job. Pastor's life was very hard. Most pastors had 3 or 4 churches. Most pastors could not meet the high educational requirements that were called for, and they got a very low salary. The average salary was $200 a year, and even in 2023 dollars, that's still less than $5,000 a year. So they were not being paid very much. So most of them had to do something on the side, like teach in a schoolhouse. This is a schoolhouse across from a church in Pomeria, South Carolina. So they taught, they farmed, a couple of them ran mercantile shops because they simply couldn't afford to live on what a pastor was paid. But a final and very important reason for forming the North Carolina Synod was to combat evangelical revivalism. Now, these are the sort of Billy Graham crusades of the day, right? Instead of being held in a huge football stadium or an arena, they were held outdoors. And they were incredibly popular. They attracted thousands of people who would come and stay for days to hear. If you can look here in the center on this raised stage, you see there's several men standing up here. Those are all the different pastors, and they just take turn preaching, and they'll preach for 18 hours a day. So if you miss one pastor, you can come back and hear the other pastor. And they're very dramatic. Lots of interesting things happen at the revivals. And in a culture where there's not much going on, right? There's no social media, there's no football games to watch, there's no World Series to cheer for. The revival is kind of the biggest show in town. And lots of people are very convinced that revivals would be a great thing. So the question before us is, should good Lutherans go to revivals? That's the question that emerges in the early 19th century. Some say, yes, that's perfectly fine. That may seem odd to us, but for some people, they said, well, many Lutherans in the South think they're just fine. Thank you very much. Why? Because of the need to spread the gospel. We have so few pastors, so few churches. Isn't it better when everybody can come together and hear the gospel preached, even if it's by a Presbyterian or a Methodist or a Baptist or somebody? We get to hear the gospel. Because there's a lack of any kind of religious service on the frontier. My mother-in-law grew up in rural North Carolina, what is probably now downtown Charlotte, but at the time it was rural North Carolina. And she grew up Presbyterian, but her little Presbyterian church only had a pastor one Sunday a month. So the first Sunday of the month, she went to the Presbyterian church. The second Sunday of the month, she went to the Methodist church. The next Sunday, she went to the Baptist church. And the fourth Sunday, she went to the Lutheran church. That was very, very common in a lot of these areas. And so a lot of people think, isn't cooperation more important than just saying we're just going to worship with Lutherans because there aren't enough of us? And a lot of these Lutherans believe, they're pietist Lutherans, they believe that good behavior is really important. And the revivals put a lot of emphasis on good behavior. And so many think, not all, but many think that they're just fine as long as they're done decently and in good order. The good Lutheran catchphrase, right? You don't want people jumping up and down and screaming too much, just a little bit. But as long as they're done decently and in good order, that's okay. The interesting thing is the Synod of North Carolina and adjacent states, now remember that's from Virginia all the way to Georgia, they began to change their minds on this. At first, they were formed at least in part to combat revivalism, but they began to sort of warm up to the idea. So by 1809, they say every pastor should be allowed to permit fellow Christians of other regular religious confessions to come to Holy Communion. Okay, so that means your Baptist and your Methodist and your Presbyterian neighbor can join you at Holy Communion. That's fine. By 1810, the next year, ministers are, quote, encouraged to hold protracted meetings of 3 days and welcome the participation of Moravian and Reformed pastors. In other words, we are encouraging ministers to hold revivals and invite other denominations to participate with us. The next year, they passed a resolution against dancing and its injurious influence and effects. The same year, they say that unrepentant sinners guilty of the sins in Galatians 5:19-21 must be excluded from Holy Communion. And congregational officers are instructed to attend the preparatory service before the Lord's Supper to exclude those who are openly wicked. I'll let you go look up what Galatians 5:19 is all about. But what this is saying is that church council members will now decide who is righteous enough to receive communion. Who is righteous enough to receive communion? So it's heavily influenced by this revival sort of mentality, right? Now, many in the Eastern churches, North and South, began to desire a larger church body. And so there's this sense we need a larger organization. And in 1820, churches in the North and the South, Lutheran churches North and South, form a body called the General Synod. It's sort of like the ELCA of its day, but it brings those churches together in sort of an advisory capacity. And it's the first large Lutheran body in the United States. New York, North Carolina, and adjacent states, Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania all join in. So pretty much the people on the Eastern Seaboard. But not everybody is happy about this, particularly some people in what is today the Southeastern Synod. They don't like revivals in general, and they don't like the formation of the General Synod in particular. One person wrote in that the church was getting too sucked into these revivals. Instead of less of that disgusting stuff about go-up revivals, screaming, clapping of hands at the hypocrite's bench, you and your newspaper have more of it every week. You and the other revival boys are advocating this railroad Christianity, according to which they become sinlessly perfect in an hour, for the same reason the Presbyterians have adopted it, that our people might not desert and go to the Methodist. In other words, he's saying the only reason you people are advocating revivals is you don't want your people to leave and go join another church. Alter the Lutheran Church's name, forsake. Name your paper, call it New Measure, Fanatical, Methodistical, Anti-Lutheran Engine, or Advocate of Screaming, Falling, Clapping of Hands of Hypocrisies and Lies. So not everybody liked the idea of Lutherans going to revivals, right? And there were some people who thought this General Synod was not nearly Lutheran enough. They shouldn't be advocating going to revivals, among other things. And it gets concentrated around two members of this family, Paul Hinkle and his son, David Hinkle. And David Hinkle begins his ministry at the age of 17, very young. He's licensed to preach at 18, and he's a brilliant young man. He's just brilliant. He's fluent in German and English, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. There's no question he's a brilliant guy. But he runs into trouble with his candidacy committee because he is not, shall we say, very easy to get along with sometimes. And there's some complaints from some members of his congregations. Well, the Synod was supposed to ordain him. Remember, he had moved up in those ranks that we talked about earlier, and he expected to be ordained at a meeting, but the Synod refused to ordain him. Well, that really causes a big brouhaha. So in 1819, his father and his brothers, who are all Lutheran pastors, ordained David themselves under, quote, the shade of the trees. So they have defied the Synod, and they have ordained David individually themselves. And the next year, the Hinkles and others form the Tennessee Synod, the Tennessee Synod. They secede from the North Carolina and adjacent state synod and form their own synod, the Tennessee Synod. What makes it distinctive? Well, for one thing, it insists on congregational polity. No synod can tell a congregation what to do. Every congregation is able to do what it wants to do. You have to be able to, if you want to vote, you have to be able to speak German. So there's a language element here, although this requirement is gone within 5 years. But originally, when it starts, you had to be able to, if you wanted to vote, you had to speak German. They don't want to join any national body. They're not interested in forming seminaries and other institutions with other Lutherans. They're very, very congregational. They have a number of objections to this General Synod. They have some theological objections. They think that the Synod has not adhered well enough to the Augsburg Confession, which you learned about last week. And they say the General Synod is all about popery. It's trying to put a new Catholic Church over Lutherans. They maintain that Lutherans should hold themselves apart from others, and true Lutherans should not worship with anyone who is not a Lutheran. They don't believe in revivals because they say that they subvert traditional Lutheran theology of salvation by grace. Revivals, they say, divide people into sheep and goats and put more emphasis on the preacher than on the word from the Bible. And revivals dilute Lutheran understandings of the sacraments. So they've got a pretty potent theological position, right? Because they say we're saved by God's grace, not by works. And revivals make it look like when you're saying yes to Jesus, that it's on you and it's not on God's action. So they're making a pretty trenchant thing. But as I tell my students, it's never just about theology, right? These disagreements that divide people in churches are never just about theology. Look at the title of a very famous book that David wrote, The Carolinian Herald of Liberty, Religious and Political. There's a lot of political stuff going on in here. It's the whole debate between federalism, how much authority should the nation have and the states have, versus Jacksonian democracy, right? So it's part of that debate. They reject what they see as a federal church government in favor of a more congregational states' rights position. There's some social economic parts of this. It's people in the country versus people in the town. It's about economics and things like that. It's also very personal. David is just, I hate to say it, but he's just kind of an obnoxious person, right? I won't even read you all these things, but he's just unsparing in his criticism. Even his father had to admit that some of his sermons were very long. And he said that, to make his point that Lutherans should not interact with non-Lutherans, he said Presbyterian boys should not be allowed to date Lutheran girls because it would be like allowing cows and horses to mate. Cows and horses to mate. So he is a person of strong language and strong opinions. I mean, there's just no two ways about it. Well, the fallout of all of this is when they formed their Tennessee Synod, lots of people joined them from other places besides Tennessee. Greene County is a big center of it, but so is New Market, Virginia. So is Piedmont, North Carolina. So is the Dutch Fork of South Carolina. This is a picture of a church in South Carolina that's split down the middle over this. Should we be in the North Carolina Synod or should we be in the Tennessee Synod? So they solved the problem by calling two pastors, one from the North Carolina Synod and one from the Tennessee Synod. And you just went to church on the Sunday your pastor was preaching. This poor church divided into four parts because it was already sharing a part of their church with a group of Presbyterians. And then the Lutherans split. And so you have two kinds of Lutherans, Tennessee Synod and North Carolina Synod and Presbyterians. And then the Tennessee Synod split because there was a pastor in the Tennessee Synod who apparently played around with the church organist and got the church organist pregnant. And so the Tennessee Synod said, we're going to defrock you. You can't be a pastor in the Tennessee Synod anymore. Well, some of the members said, well, you can't do that. We have congregational autonomy. You as a synod cannot tell us who can our pastor be and who cannot. And he may be an SOB, but he's ours, right? You can't tell us what to do. So there are four congregations worshiping in this one building. This mess, I'll just call it that, extends all kinds of ways. This is even a will that somebody left property to a church, unless you let the Hinkelites in which case I will disown my children if they ever let any Hinkelites in this church. Southern Seminary, where I teach, forms in 1830 in the middle of this, squarely on the side of the North Carolina Synod, not the Tennessee Synod. The controversy is repeated in Pennsylvania, different names, but the same sort of controversy. And you get two seminaries up there, Gettysburg and Philadelphia. And this controversy lasts over 100 years. 100 years. And the irony is, eventually there are churches from the Tennessee Synod from Virginia to Alabama, but none in Tennessee. It's really kind of odd. Tennessee becomes sort of a state of mind rather than a geographical location. But it takes 100 years to solve that issue. They finally all merged back together in 1921-22. This has taken place, but a much larger division is going across the country as well, right? Here's a map of the United States in 1850. Now, this is a political cartoon map which shows what the United States looks like in the view of the person writing this cartoon of, in 1850. And you see there are two trees here. This tree stretches from Pennsylvania, New York, all the way across to the west. This tree is called God's Blessing Liberty, and it's healthy and its branches are spreading out. But down here in the southeast, you have another tree that's bent and gnarled, and this is God's curse, slavery. The question of slavery, as we've already seen, had existed almost since the first settlement in North America. And Lutherans dealt with it in similar ways to other churches in the country. In fact, almost exactly the same way that other churches did. There's really actually an interesting shift that takes place. Before 1820, many evangelical denominations, North and South, were originally anti-slavery. Early groups like the Baptists, the Methodists, the Salzburger Lutherans, even the Tennessee Synod Lutherans opposed slavery. But by the 1830s, they've almost all capitulated to the culture, and they all have moved over into the support of slavery camp. Now, here's another map also in 1850, and you can see in this, this is the red indicates slaves as a percentage of total population by county. So if you look at this map, you see that the darker red an area is, the more enslaved persons there are in that county. So you see the darkest red here on the Mississippi and in the Delta, here around the low country of South Carolina and Savannah area, Georgia, less in the mountainous regions of Tennessee, Virginia, Kentucky. But that gives you an idea of how distinctive the differences were between the Southeast and different parts of the country. So how did Lutherans deal with this issue as the nation rolled on to catastrophe? Well, one way they dealt with it was in 1814, they came up with what they call a 5-point plan. So Lutherans said Black persons, both slave and free, should be prepared and fitted for full acceptance in our church, according to their situation in society. In other words, we want to prepare them to be Christians in our Lutheran churches, but in recognition of their status and their situation in the culture at large. They said that they must be instructed before they could be admitted to Holy Communion. And they were also required to demonstrate a holy life before they were admitted to communion. Now, to be fair, this was the same requirement for whites as well. So that was a common thing. Not only did you have to be instructed, you had to prove you behaved yourself before you could take Holy Communion. I wonder how many of us would be able to take Holy Communion if we had that rule today, right? But they added another one for enslaved persons. They must serve a probationary period before being admitted to communion. In other words, you have to really mean it. You have to really want to come for Lutheran communion, and you have to prove it by serving a probationary period. Christian slaves could have their children baptized. Enslaved Christians could even stand as godparents for children. But then there was a distinctive rule about slave marriage. And the rule was slaves can be married in the Lutheran Church, and they were to be faithful to their partner unless separated by sale. In other words, they honored the sanctity of marriage unless the master decided to sell them apart from each other, in which case they made no protest and just said that they're no longer, that marriage is now under different rules. Since they're never going to see each other again, if they have the permission of their respective masters, they can remarry. There's no attempt to bring them back together. There's just a recognition that that's the reality of what slavery looks like. They might be separated by sale. I've already mentioned the Tennessee Synod as an exception. They actually asked early in 1820, is slavery to be considered as an evil? Yes, it is a great evil. We hope we can get rid of it. But that didn't last. Within 10 years, they're just like everybody else and changed their mind on the issue. It's a very important person in Charleston named John Bachman, who's a pastor at St. John's, who's really very influential in the life of three very significant Black figures coming out of the Charleston area. Jehu Jones, who was the first African American ordained as a Lutheran pastor in America. Boston Drayton, who became the first Black missionary to Liberia and later the Chief Justice of Liberia's Supreme Court in Africa. And Daniel Payne, who was not a member of his church, but was an acquaintance of John Bachman, and John Bachman wrote him a recommendation that sends him to Gettysburg Seminary, Lutheran Seminary in the North. So Bachman is a very strong advocate of some individual Black members of his congregation in Charleston. He has over 200 members, 200 Black members, slave and free, in his congregation. And yet, Bachman very forcefully defends slavery in 1857 in print, listing all the reasons why slavery is a good thing. Why slavery is a good thing. It raises the question why any enslaved person would want to become a Christian, right? Because many in the original days were even asking, should we even give our slaves Christianity? Because if I let my slave become a Christian, can I hold my Christian brother or sister in bondage? So it was a real legitimate question. Can I hold an enslaved brother or sister in bondage? They finally decided, yes, we can. Enslaved persons came with their own religions already. Back in Africa, they had to have native tribal religions. Some were Muslim. So why would any enslaved person actually want to take on the religion of their enslaver, right? Well, because they actually begin to hear the gospel in a new way. Not just slaves obey your master, not just slaves don't steal from your master. They hear other parts of the gospel, like God's judgment fell on those like Pharaoh who enslaved the people of Israel. God freed the people of Israel. Jesus has come to free me. And revival worship looks and feels an awful lot like our African style of worship. And so African Americans begin to take on Christianity because they hear the gospel in a new and powerful way. At the same time, others are arguing that slavery is a good thing. They say, for example, the Bible allows it. There is slavery in the Bible, right? Moses, Abraham, all the patriarchs had slaves. Jesus never said anything against slavery. And surely if Jesus hadn't liked slavery, he would have said something about it. Paul sends a slave back to his master, Onesimus, and urges his master to take him back because he's run away, but take him back and treat him as kindly, right? They argue, we take better care of our enslaved persons than you do of the immigrants who are working in your textile mills and factories. We bring them the gospel. On the other hand, the anti-slavery arguments say, you can't argue that. Slavery brutalizes man. In the title of a work by Daniel Payne, slavery brutalizes man. Not only the enslaved person, but it brutalizes the enslaver. It makes them less human, less Christian. Christ has given us a new commandment that supersedes all other commandments, to love one another. And how can you possibly love a person you've enslaved? We are commanded to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And can you honestly say that you would be willing to take the place of your slave and trade places and have them do to you what you were doing to them? They often quoted from Galatians 3:28, in Christ there is no Jew or Greek, slave, male and female, slave or free. And finally, the heart of the gospel is mercy. Both of these groups are reading the same Bible, the same words, and yet they're reading them past each other in very different ways. Over time, the tensions rise, the positions harden. The churches all over the country began to split before the war. The Presbyterians split into a Northern Presbyterian Church and a Southern Presbyterian Church in 1837. The Methodists split in 1844 into a Northern Methodist Church and a Southern Presbyterian Church. The Baptists split in 1845. The Episcopalians sort of split in 1861. I say sort of because the Northern Episcopalians never acknowledged that they formally left. They just marked them absent for 5 years and said, "You'll be back. We'll see you when you come back." The Lutherans don't split until 1863, after the Civil War has already started, but not because they're any better at it than anyone else. Southern churches in Missouri Synod support slavery in Missouri because, well, slavery's in the Bible and we are literalist Bible readers. The Northern churches oppose it, but they have a gentleman's agreement. We're just not going to talk about it. That's how we'll solve this problem. We are just not going to talk about it. It's a political issue. It's not a church issue. It's not a religious issue. So we are not going to talk about it. This Synod will not at any time enter into a discussion of slavery, says the Synod of South Carolina and adjacent states, which by this time includes Georgia. For Lutherans, the split in the country comes after the split in the church, but just because they can't do it any earlier. Because once the Civil War starts, everything has changed, and each side begins to claim that God is on our side. In the North, Northern Lutherans say it is the deliberate judgment of this Synod that the rebellion against the constitutional of this government is most wicked in its inception, unjustified in its cause, unnatural in its character, inhuman in its prosecution, oppressive in its aims, and destructive in its results to the highest interest of morality and religion. We therefore pray for the Army and Navy that our beloved land may speedily be delivered from treason and anarchy. The Virginia Synod writes, in view of the final disruption of the former United States, the unscrupulous despotism of Washington, the uncharitable and intolerant spirit of those we thought were brothers in the same faith, this demands that we at once dissolve all ecclesiastical alliance with them. North Carolina, resolved that in the hand of God, in the heroism of our brave defenders, we see those who have enabled us to form a government of our choice. And to them, our undivided allegiance is due. And finally, merged in a war of self-defense, the preservation of religious, social, and political liberties, our cause is in the hands of an infinite justice, and if faithful to God and to our country, we cannot fear for the result. The church splits. I want to point out these are all statements by the churches, not by politicians, not by business leaders. These are the statements of the churches. And the results are, of course, catastrophic. The destruction across the South is extreme and widespread, and it will take a long, long time for these areas to recover. All right, I want to stop here for just a minute before we move to the mid-19th century, which we will spend less time with than we have in the past. But if we have just a question or two, maybe.
I will note that we do have, going back a little ways in the chat, somebody who's actually a member of St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands Church, proudly proclaims that heritage, and has been have generations of family there since 1840 that they can trace back, which is quite a unique treasure. So thank you, Nicole, for sharing that with us. And we've had some people mention land recognitions for Indigenous folks who inhabited the lands that we are all on here in, at least in North America specifically. Some folks mentioned having a German-American father confirmed by a Swedish pastor in a church in rural Minnesota. Folks from upstate New York, where the first pastor of the congregation baptized enslaved people by force, which was sort of the custom of the era. And they're actually doing a genealogical study to reach out to these folks to make formal apologies and such, which is important. There was as you mentioned, down in Salzburg, a formal apology. There's some dark things that we have to face, I think, and that's been a real challenge. But I know here in the Southeastern Synod, we did such a thing down in Jerusalem Lutheran Church, where it was believed to be a slave cemetery.
Yes.
And I believe we worked, Bishop Julian Gordy worked with either you or other historians to help us kind of clarify some things and make
Yeah, I didn't work on that, but I do know that effort. Yes.
Yeah. Well, let me stop commenting there. Are there other folks who want to share anything here briefly? We've got about, say, 15 minutes till the end of our time together. But somebody is mentioning here that there are 2 Lutheran churches next door to one another in Claremont, North Carolina, where one was part of the Tennessee Synod and the other North Carolina Synod.
Oh, a student of mine actually sent me a picture one time in his first call. He was going back through their archives and found a statement still on the books in his church that their pastor shall always be a pastor of the Tennessee Synod. It had never been rescinded. So
it's like you can't have a pet elephant in North Carolina or something.
Right.
All right, thank you.
Let's jump ahead to the second wave of immigration. As I say, I wanted to spend a little more time with the Southeast since a lot of us here are from that area. But there is a second wave of immigration that begins to come in the 19th century from the Scandinavian countries like Sweden and Denmark and Norway and Finland. And these mid-19th century immigrant Lutherans are a different sort of group. They often, there's a major difference. They often come as groups, as communities. They often bring their pastors. Remember, in the Eastern Seaboard, a lot of people came on their own. In the Midwest, they often came as a whole community and they came with pastors. The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is part of this. The Germans come to the St. Louis area in the mid-19th century and form the Missouri Synod. The Norwegians have a great presence in the Midwest. The Swedes also begin to move in. The Danes as well. And all of these groups, as I say, have strong pastoral leadership. Life is still very hard. As you can see, living in a dugout on the prairies. What they find is still where they're going in the Midwest, few churches. They're also surprised to find there's no state support. They're also surprised to find unexpected religious diversity and the freedom to structure worship and theology and organizations as they wished. They just didn't have the chance to do that back in the old country. And just as in the Eastern Seaboard, this loosened control exposes some fissures, and divisions are very common over issues of theological debate as they work out competing strands of Lutheranism. Do we put more emphasis on right belief or on right behavior, that kind of thing? Because now they have the freedom to do that in America. Because they come as whole communities with their pastors, their ethnic culture and language is very important, and they can live in a little enclave and only speak Norwegian or only speak Swedish or Finnish or Danish. And they keep it for a really long time because it represents home and the familiar. I don't know if anybody on the chat is from the Norwegian tradition where they eat lutefisk. Lutefisk used to be peasant food, right? When you could eat nothing else. It's fish soaked in lye. But then it becomes sort of this cultural touchstone, right? Even when you can afford other food besides this peasant food. It represents home. It represents something familiar. Worship and piety in the old ways also represents something that's familiar. And so you see churches built on the inside that look a lot like churches back in the old country. You see different languages enshrined in the stained glass or on the altars. These different groups create their own schools and their seminaries to maintain their cultures. So the Midwest is full of all these Lutheran schools like Augustana College, Gustavus Adolphus, St. Olaf, their own seminaries. So they nourish their culture, but it largely keeps them pretty isolated too. And the key is not just from other Americans, but also from other Lutherans. The Swedish Lutherans do not talk to the Norwegian Lutherans. The German Lutherans do not talk to the Danish Lutherans. The Finnish Lutherans don't speak to anybody, right? So they're very isolated by their culture and their language. And so you get this chart, right, that we looked at the very beginning very briefly, of all these different groups divided by language, by theology, by culture. By the late 1800s, you have dozens of Lutheran groups in America. And it's not really until the early 20th century that Lutherans begin to seriously work across some of those lines. There are many push and pull factors that begin to finally bring them into conversation with each other. One of those is actually lay people. It's the rise of the lay women's groups. It's the rise of the lay men's groups that really began to work together as they work to raise money and support foreign missions in places like India, in places like Madagascar, in places like Japan. The women in particular were incredibly influential in raising money. They had what they call mite boxes. Some of you may remember these or still have them in your welcome groups. The idea was this would sit on your kitchen, by your kitchen sink, and if you were particularly grateful for something, you'd put in a penny or a nickel or a quarter. And then at a designated time, everyone would bring in their mite boxes. They'd be emptied to go and support foreign missionaries. Well, a lot of times, these women find that women in the North, Lutheran women in the North, are doing the same sort of work they're doing in the South. Lutheran men in Pennsylvania find that Lutheran men in the Midwest are doing the same kind of work they're doing. And so they start to talk to each other. But it's really the cataclysm of World War I that makes an enormous change in these conversations. World War I is an incredible shock to the system. Everybody thinks that is long gone. But anti-German hysteria grows up in enormous ways in the United States. People are always looking for scapegoats. During World War I, it was the Germans and anyone descended from the Germans. And practically anyone who spoke any foreign language was considered suspect or even an enemy of the state. And so churches that had spoken German for decades overnight switched to English to prove their loyalty, right? Norwegians and Swedes do the same thing. Even though they're not targeted quite as much, anyone who speaks a foreign language gets somewhat targeted. The other thing they want to do is Lutherans want to provide chaplains to their boys in the military service. So they go to the United States government and say, we want to support our boys in the troops. We also want to prove our loyalty as American citizens, right? But the United States military, strangely enough, is not willing to say that they will take 22 different kinds of Lutheran church pastors as chaplains. They say, you go sort it out. We will take one kind of Lutheran chaplain, you figure it out. We're not going to put up with all these other kinds. And amazingly, they do. They figure it out. They start to talk to each other. They work together. They raise money to support basically what we would call USO places for soldiers to come for relief. And when the war is over, they begin to say, oh, and then there's the Quadricentennial in 1917, which is the 400th anniversary of the Reformation. And so on the East Coast, Lutherans in the North and Lutherans in the South who divided over the Civil War start to come together to plan, how can we celebrate the Quadricentennial? To make a long story short, they decide the best way to observe it is to merge back together and heal the wounds of the Civil War. So Lutherans North and South heal those wounds of the Civil War thanks to the celebration of the 400th anniversary of the Reformation. So Lutherans are beginning to talk to each other. And after the war is over, they say, why don't we continue this? And they do. They continue to work to help refugees in Europe, collecting clothing and food and all kinds of things for the refugees from Europe. The women groups continue to talk to each other, and this accelerates even more after World War II. After World War II, we get really systematic groups like Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, which is founded in 1939 to deal with the crisis of people who are leaving Nazi Germany. We get Lutheran World Action in 1940 to help. We get Lutheran World Relief at the end of the war to again collect money to send to feed the starving in Europe. All of these different things begin to bring Lutherans together to work together on common efforts. Chaplains working with displaced persons. And of course, after the war is over, we begin to get this massive movement of people across the country. We get interstate highway systems. We get the GI Bill. people who had never gone to college before. First generation people are going to college, and they're moving all across the country. They're building out the suburbs. And as they start to move out of their little ethnic conclaves, whether it was on the East Coast or in the Midwest, they start to say, you know, the type of Lutheran church we join just doesn't seem as important as it used to. You know, my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents belonged to the Norwegian Anti-Missouri Brotherhood Church. That's a real church, by the way, the Anti-Missouri Brotherhood. But these Lutherans on this corner seem very nice, right? And that was helped along by the fact that some common worship books are coming out. In 1918, all Lutherans on the East Coast have a new book, the Black Book. Some of you may remember the Black Book. I remember the Black Book. And also the Red Book, the first Red Book in 1958 is put together by almost all Lutherans in America, except the Missouri Synod. So now I can be in California, I can be in Pennsylvania, I can be in Georgia, and we're all using the same Red Book. That brings people together. Youth events begin to bring people together. The rise of Luther Leagues, Walther Leagues in the Missouri Synod, the rise of church camps in the mid-20th century. I mean, how many of you spent your first time in a church camp in the mid or later 20th century, meeting people from other places, right? Or going to a youth gathering, and you meet people, Lutherans from all over the country. You might even meet, in 1961, Dr. Martin Luther King, who came to speak to the American Lutheran Church's youth gathering. Very controversial. The American Lutheran Church got hundreds of letters of protest. They invited him anyway. And so now these young Lutheran people are beginning to think about not just what it means to become a Lutheran in America, but actually, what does it mean to be an American? Though there have been efforts since the 18th century, as we've seen, it's really in the 20th century that Lutherans intentionally, if still quite imperfectly, begin to reach beyond their traditional boundaries. Black Lutheran churches begin to expand in the 20th century, particularly in places like Alabama and other places in the Southeast. Rosa Young is very influential in this, founds many Black Lutheran congregations in Alabama, many Lutheran schools. Many of these started out as Missouri Synod. Some of these are now part of the ELCA. But an enormous effort of Lutheran schools. This is the St. Paul Lutheran School in 1917, St. Philip's in Baltimore. These are Lutherans in Washington, D.C., who are very active in the civil rights movement and actually participated in the March on Washington in 1961. Indian missions begin to grow. Again, a lot of this is very imperfect, but there's more intentional outreach to people who are not within the traditional Lutheran fold, so to speak. This is a picture of the Rocky Boy Mission, Alaska Indigenous people in San Juan, Puerto Rico. This is down again in, this is on St. Croix in the U.S. Virgin Islands. This is Sister Emma Francis. Again, I have to say that sadly, a lot of these efforts were not always supported fully and were often undermined. Sister Emma Francis, for example, had hoped to work as a missionary in Africa, but the church felt that she would not be respected by the white missionaries on the field, and so they brought her home to minister in Caribbean islands. So moving together was never easy. Not nearly as easy as this very quick flash history makes it appear. There were cultural differences, theological differences, and regional differences that persisted. And yet, throughout the 20th century, many Lutherans became convinced that more united them than divided them, and that they could do more in ministry together than they could do separately. So by the early 1960s, there are three major Lutheran bodies: the ALC, which was mostly concentrated in the Midwest, but not exclusively, which tended to be more congregational in its polity and a bit more conservative. There was the LCA, mostly on the East Coast, but not exclusively. It tended to be a bit more progressive and a bit more ecumenical. And then the last group was the Missouri Synod, which tended to be very conservative, but it was beginning to change. Believe it or not, you remember the Green Book? Some of you probably still have the Green Book. It was actually the Missouri Synod that initiated the work on the Green Book in 1965. And they said, why don't all of the Lutherans in the country come together and form a new hymnal? Because we've seen how important hymnals are for bringing people together. They withdrew at the last minute because of subsequent events that were taking place, but they are the ones who initiated that. But it was not to be. Controversy erupted in the Missouri Synod between conservatives and moderates. The conservative Missouri Synod president attacked the president and faculty of Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, their flagship seminary, for being too liberal. The issue was over biblical interpretation, and the Missouri Synod leadership accused the seminary leadership of being too liberal on biblical interpretation. It eventually comes to a head with a walkout in 1974, where almost the entire faculty and the student body literally walks out of Concordia Seminary and starts a new seminary, Seminex, or Seminary in Exile. And that's important to the story because they form a new church called the Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches, the AELC. It's never a very big group, but they are critical in bringing together the other two groups. The ALC and the LCA are brought together by the AELC to say, let's form a new church. And they are the ones who then form the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. A commission for a new Lutheran church is formed in the mid-1980s and finally brings together these three church bodies into one and the new church begins in 1988. Just recently, a commission for a renewed Lutheran church has been formed to say, now where do we go? Some 35 years on from the formation of the ELCA, what do we need to keep the same? What do we need to rethink and think about for the future? So that's a very flash history. Again, as I said at the beginning, I want you to think about what echoes from the past do we hear in our experiences today? What, if anything, do we want to take from our past into the future? And what is it time to leave behind? And finally, the continual question that's always been asked, what does it mean to be a Lutheran in America today? Every single group and every time has answered that question. And that answer has changed. And if you learn nothing from history, I hope one thing you take away is very few times do things remain the same. Things are always changing, right? The context may change, but the gospel remains. It remains for us to think about how do we then talk about that gospel in the context in which we live and minister and work today. I will stop there and see if there are any final questions, but thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. McArver. I would invite those of you who are here to maybe give us a couple more minutes. Would love to. I know we're at time. If you need to go, that's fine, but we started a little bit late, so would beg of you just a couple more minutes. Dr. McArver, my question to you is, being a historian, how aware are folks of kind of where they've come from or where we've come from, generally speaking? Do you find that people are well versed in this? Do you think people lack knowledge in this? And I guess what drives you to kind of keep doing this work that you've been doing of history?
I think what drives me is people don't know the stories, right? And what I think is important to realize is stories shape us whether we know them or not, right? We are shaped by things that happened before we were born, whether we know that or not. If we know it, we can deal with it in a much more thoughtful and careful way than if we don't know it, right?
Well, and also recently read the book by Robert Jones, White Too Long, which talks about the legacy of white supremacy in American Christianity, which is a deep dive into the complicity of the church in racist behavior and racist, sort of, as you said, kind of aligning with the larger culture around racism. And so that's something I would lift up to folks if you want to take a little deeper dive into that particular part of the church's history in America. Some folks have given you some accolades here in the chat. There have been some folks talking about church camp. When you mentioned church camp, deep memories there. And my own children have experienced church camp, and I've experienced church camp. I'll leave it open to you folks. Does anybody else want to unmute yourself and give a question here before we go? Somebody even commented in Swedish.
Oh,
Thank you
that's
very
so
much.
cool. That is so cool.
I'm not going to pronounce it because I think I might mess it up. So I'll leave it there. And I'll probably put that in the follow-up email, because we're going to get a follow-up email, folks, with recordings and some notes from the meeting today and some links as well. I don't see any other questions. Any last comments you want to make, Dr. McArver?
No, except I just want to thank the Southeastern Synod for sponsoring this. I just think this is a one, talk about context, right? If nothing else, we learned during COVID how to do some things in a new way, and this is one of them. The fact that I can present this from my home to your homes from all over is an amazing opportunity, and I thank you for putting this together.
Well, you're welcome. And we are sharing at least with hundreds, and hopefully those hundreds will share. We've really tried to structure this so that folks can take these recordings, take a worksheet with a little description and some questions, and you can use it in a Sunday school, a Bible study, at home kind of study, wherever you want to take it with you. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Dr. McArver, for leading us this evening. It's been wonderful. And we'll send a link so folks can know where to get not only this recording, but also the whole series on our website. Please feel free to share it far and wide with folks, and I'll just be happy to now close us out with a word of prayer this evening. Let us pray. Gracious God, as we look back to our past, may we continue to ponder your movement of your Spirit, where it's led us, where we are called to be humble, where we are called to be where we are called to seek forgiveness, where we're called to seek forgiveness and truth telling and reconciliation. We ask for those words and that Spirit to move us in a place where we can be called together, to be united, that we can walk alongside one another regardless of race, culture, political divide, that we might be able to be humble enough to follow the movement of your Spirit, that it might bring us together as one. We give you thanks for this time. We give you thanks for the gifts of our speakers, including tonight with Dr. McArver, that you've inspired all of them to help us in our faith journey this day. We ask you now that you watch over us this evening into a new and glorious day tomorrow. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you all so much, and we hope you have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Good night.